Before I begin, some people have wondered where part 3 of the Belgica saga is, and I'll tell you. There is an image in that story which is incredibly metal, just very, very metal. So I asked Volksvikstoth, who sometimes does music for my review show, to do a fictional song about it. Just like a 30-second snippet, I can put it in there. And then I asked a fantastically talented guy called DeVillo to do a cover for a fictional metal album. It was going to be a little thing, just a sprinkling of silliness in the video. Then 8 months later, I asked Volts how the song is doing, and it turns out she read my script about the Belgica, all 3 parts, and got so interested in the story that she bought a book and decided to do a full song. Then she read the book, and now she's partway through a concept album. And it really doesn't feel right to upload the video without some music. Now, we all know that I tend to talk about polar exploration, but that's not my only interest in history. I'm sure I'll eventually do videos on much more varied stuff like Sylvia Pankhurst, the suffragette that Lenin said was too left-wing, and became the friend of Haile Selassie, the Rastafarian prophet/god. Or the tale of Admiral Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, the German intelligence service during World War II, who spent the entire war undermining the Nazis and trying to lose the war. But as a midpoint between that kind of video and what you expect from me, the adventures of British people going somewhere cold and accidentally killing themselves, I'm going to take a look at Everest. Not any of the very famous dead climbers, there are many of them, but instead a man called Maurice Wilson. A man I suggest you never try to emulate. It'll end just as badly, and the chances are you won't get as far as he did. Just so you know, there are a few photos of Maurice Wilson and, to my knowledge, no footage. So I'm going to use footage from the Epic of Everest, the 1924 documentary about George Mallory's last expedition. It was shot 9 years before Wilson's arrival at Everest, and there are a few better sources of footage for the mountain before it became a tourist trap. Anyway, Wilson was born in 1898 in Bradford, and his life was fairly uneventful until he joined the army aged 18. Wilson fought in World War I, and he fought very bravely, earning himself a medal and going up the ranks to captain. And on one occasion, single-handedly defending a machine gun post against a lot of advancing Germans. Alas, he didn't finish the war uninjured, mentally or physically. He was racked with a never-ending cough and near-constant pain, and fell into a very deep depression. He was a financial success, though, making his fortune in England, the USA, and New Zealand. And in 1932, he met someone that changed his life. And we don't know who it was, or if they existed at all. He was a mysterious healer who he said cured him and left him with the unshakable belief that anything can be achieved with prayer, deep enough belief, and by fasting a lot. So convinced was he in his new religious deepening that he decided to tell the world. And how better to do that than by flying to Nepal, crashing a plane in Everest, and then climbing the rest of the way. There were several flaws in his plan, though. 1, he didn't know how to fly a plane. 2, he wasn't a mountaineer. And 3, Everest wouldn't be summited successfully for several more decades. So he set about trying to iron out those flaws. First, he bought a plane, which he called the Everest, and got his pilot's license. But he was such a poor student that it took him about twice as long as normal to get at. And when he told his instructor about his plan, he was told that he'd never even reach India, let alone Nepal in that plane. Remember, this is the early 30s, years before Amelia Earhart's disappearance. The idea of a second-hand plane making that journey with a good pilot would have been a tall order. With Wilson, it'd be like climbing Everest, ironically. And what sort of plane did he have? A de Havilland DH-60 Moth, a biplane designed for training in short trips. But it was used for longer ones when matched with a skilled pilot, such as Francis Chichester, who flew one from England to Australia. But Wilson was not a skilled pilot, and he told his instructor that he would succeed, or he would die trying. Well, at least he got one thing right. Anyway, while he learned to fly, kinda, he took an unorthodox approach to mountaineering, never learning how to use crampons, ice axes, or how to climb ice or snow at all. He instead spent some weeks wandering around Snowdonia, home of Snowdon, not even the tallest mountain in the UK, that's Ben Nevis in Scotland, a stately 4,400 feet. Or 7 times shorter than Everest, and then he walked from London to Bradford to build up endurance. Now, to give you an idea of how bad this was, even back then, the last big attempt to reach the summit of Everest had been in 1924, George Mallory and Andrew Irvine. Mallory was probably the most celebrated mountaineer of the day, and Irving was inexperienced but gifted. They climbed into the fog, and it took 70 years for Mallory's body to be found. Then it took another 25 years for Irving's boot to be found. But Wilson had belief on his side, so shortly before leaving, Wilson crashed his plane, delaying him for several weeks and giving time for the British media to notice his plan and drum up support for the underdog taking the climbing establishment. Alas, it also gave the climbing establishment time to notice, complain to the government, and for the government to ban him from flying in an effort to save his life. So obviously he left once repairs were completed. When he arrived in Cairo to refuel, he found out he wasn't allowed to fly for Persia, so instead he had to fly to Bahrain, where the British consulate banned him from refueling, again in an effort to save his life. Finally, after a lot of debate, he was allowed to refuel on the condition that he flew back to the UK. So obviously after refueling he headed for India, landing in Gwadar on the far west of the country. When he arrived in India, he'd gone beyond the plane's flight limit and it was literally running on fumes. He landed with almost precisely no fuel left. After more refueling and flying, he arrived in Lal Balu and had his plane impounded on the orders of the British government. The overall journey took 2 weeks, and his main method of navigation? A child's atlas. As he couldn't crash into Everest as planned, he travelled to Tibet the normal way and was denied entry. So he convinced 3 Sherpas to sneak him in. They dressed up as Buddhist monks. As he couldn't speak the language, he pretended to be deaf-mute. And after weeks more travel, they arrived at the monastery near Everest. There he was given access to equipment left behind by Hugh Rutledge's 1933 expedition. And if he took any of the equipment, it wasn't a lot. So after spending some days getting lost and trying and failing to climb a glacier, he found an old mountaineering camp complete with usable crampons, which he threw away because he didn't know what they were. On the 5th day, he was still far below his first target, one of Hugh Rutledge's old camps, so made his way back to the monastery, arriving back on day 9, snowblind, exhausted and injured. After some weeks of rest, he set out again, this time with some of the Sherpas who snuck him into Tibet, and they made it to Rutledge's camp in 3 days. So instead of going an easier route, he chose to head for an icy path, because previous expeditions had said they left ropes and cut steps into the ice. And he figured they'd still be there years later. They weren't, because of course they weren't. After more days, he was met by an ice cliff, 40 feet tall, sheer and vertical. Having no tech, he had no way to climb it, and the Sherpas begged him to go back to the monastery. He refused. He was serious when he said he'd die or succeed. While the Sherpas didn't accompany him his last climb, they didn't exactly abandon him either. They camped nearby to help him down if he came to his senses. And eventually, when he didn't return, they headed back to the monastery alone, and then on to the town of Kalimpong, where they told the world what had happened to Wilson. In 1935, what was left of his tent was found, and along with it, Wilson, frozen, sitting up as though he was getting dressed. He seemingly died of either starvation or exhaustion. His diary was located, and his last entry said, "Off again! Gorgeous day!" But that wasn't likely the day he died, as he was found at his makeshift camp. Wilson was wrapped in what remained of his tent and buried in a crevasse. Because it's part of a glacier, it's slowly moving, and sometimes his remains resurface again. Last seen in the 1980s. Maybe I'll reach the top yet. Interestingly, a writer called Thomas Noyes suggested that Wilson might have made it to the summit and died on the way down, because of the discovery of an unidentified tent at 8,500 feet, much closer to the top. That kind of rumour is kind of reasonable when it comes to Mallory and Irving, but there's 2 big flaws with Wilson, apart from the obvious. A, if he'd summited, he would have mentioned it in his diary, and B, his tent was found near him. They've never actually identified the owner of the tent near the top, but that's hardly unique when it comes to Everest. It is full of detritus, technical and human. And among that detritus was an unidentified woman's high-heeled shoe discovered much later, which got mixed up with the fact that Wilson used to run a woman's clothing shop to create a kind of laughable-sounding rumour that he was a transvestite. As far as I can tell, there's nothing to it, and it originates with mountaineers trying to ridicule Wilson, which apart from being crap is kinda unnecessary. I mean, his story is already ridiculous. And that's the tale of Maurice Wilson. Someone should really do a really dark parody of underdog movies about him. The sort of film where people do the impossible and self-belief and luck and because they're the leads. But instead of succeeding, he dies at the end. Because he died at the end. But having said all that, he did make it halfway across the planet into the roof of the world on a wing and a prayer. And that alone is effing impressive. Anyway, I know it's a change from my usual history stuff, but I'm trying to branch out a bit. And like I said, I'm very into a lot of different bits of history. Tell me what you think. And don't forget to like, subscribe, hit a random bell nearby, and if you're able and enjoy what I do, please consider joining the Patreon. We have some cool rewards for you, and you'll be keeping the channel going.